Hey YouTube, Awesome Writer here, today with a Power Rangers discussion video. Now, a while back, I did a discussion video on what I think might happen with the reboot, the upcoming supposed reboot, that I thought that maybe it unfortunately might only run 1 or 2 seasons and then, you know, be canceled and let go, and then we might just go back to mmpr pandering. But some people brought up, like, what about going back to Sentai Adaptions? And honestly, I never considered that, and I thought it would be fun to have a discussion video. And this is exactly what this is. It's kind of free-form thoughts and discussion on, do I think Sentai Adaptions could ever come back for whatever reason? I don't have the answers. I didn't do any research, you know, a little bit, like in terms of just stuff I know, but I didn't specifically hunt down research, or I didn't say this is the definitive answer based on these analytics. No, it's just a thought discussion based on my experiences. And it is interesting to think about. I think in general, when it comes to any franchise, you can never say never. So in the history of now into eternity, whenever Earth's dead, or the franchise is dead, or whatever, sure, I think it's totally possible we could see it in some form. Like, even if it's just a one-off, like some company in the future owns it, or Hasbro in the future owns it and decides to do a throwback season and plucks a Sentai season and does it, sure, it's totally possible. It's not impossible. But I don't know if it's likely in the near future, and I think it brings up some interesting things when you think about how Power Rangers has survived. Like, when you really sit there and think about it, you know, how many franchises have came and went, and especially with the way that entertainment has changed with streaming and stuff, and like even amongst that, how many things have stopped and started, how it's kind of a crazy miracle that PR has more or less lasted consistently from MMPR to Cosmic Fury. Like, we've been through multiple cancellations, studios, formats, from, you know, Jetix to Nickelodeon to Netflix, and, you know, there's been the little breaks of, like, even we didn't have much of a break because we did like MMPR revisioning before Saban bought it back, so it's more or less managed to survive like a cockroach, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Again, if you contextualize it around all these other similar franchises that have had stops and starts or just complete stops, the fact that it's had a relatively similar formula for years of between 30 and 40 episode series with a consistent toy line. And then now it's finally stopped. So it's kind of crazy that it survived that long, but it almost gives me this vibe of, like, if it comes back, again, you never can say never. In a lot of ways, like, a lot of the decisions that have been made about Power Rangers still surprise me. Like, sometimes I'm still like, can't believe we did Beast Morphers. So you never say never with this franchise. But even if it comes back in some form in the future, I can't imagine it ever coming back like as it was, in terms of, you know, okay, we're back. We're just back to normal, you know, 2 20-episode seasons or 1 30-episode season, you know, every year like Sentai. Like, that's just not something we really do so much over here, outside of stuff like Law and Order that I think is still on, Grey's Anatomy, I guess, but you know what I mean. It's kind of an anomaly. It's almost adapted, like, obviously Power Rangers adapt Sentai, but it almost adapted that model that Japan is used to of, you know, Sentai and Rider are a yearly thing, except when Golf's on. And that's kind of funny, actually, when I just thought about that now, that we kind of adapted that model as something that the franchise does in a different way. And then, you know, fans get used to that, and they get used to Sentai and Rider, and they think that's the norm, even though that's the exception. And so that's kind of weird that we adapted that. But my point is that I think if we ever went back to it, I can't imagine it just being like, okay, well, we tried this thing, it didn't work, let's just go back to normal, and we're going to go back to that yearly cycle. Mainly because I think there's a lot of factors to consider. You know, when Bandai and Saban owned it, well, actually, again, it's really interesting. I just thought of something else. But when Bandai and Saban owned it, that was like their primary thing. Like, Bandai has had bigger fish before. Like, I think when Ben 10 was at its height, that was pretty major for them. But that was Bandai America I'm talking about. That was their most consistent brand. That was always a steady performer. And then obviously Saban didn't have anything else going on. So, like, they had incentive to keep it going. Like, you know, even if it only turned a small but consistent profit for them, and like with downs, they obviously had incentive. But Hasbro has bigger brands, bigger fish to fry, so you can see why maybe they wouldn't want to do it. Because I'm honestly curious, like, as we kind of know, like, I kind of always thought this, but we've got more confirmation as Cosmic Fury winded down with some interviews, that basically they kept a lot of the infrastructure of the show going from Beast Morphers to Dino Fury as initially just honoring existing contracts that they inherited, and then seems like they greenlit Dino Fury Season 2 and Cosmic Fury to keep something going for the anniversary / to keep something going before the reboot when they thought it was going to happen sooner. So we know, like, why the show continued to exist as is for a while under Hasbro, which, again, partially contractual obligation, partially like, okay, well, we already got this stuff set up, let's just leave the show going until we get the reboot. So we know why. But I am curious, like, how well it, because obviously it's done well enough to keep itself alive. Like I said, obviously Saban and Bandai had extra incentive to, because it was like their only thing. So that they had extra incentive, even if it only turned this much profit. Hey, that's consistent profit, right? So that's obviously a good reason to keep it going. And obviously, it was doing well enough to justify its existence. So I am curious, like, how well it did under Hasbro. Like, it presumably did well enough to justify its existence, you know, with a small profit. But I'm curious to know the behind-the-scenes decisions. Did they think, like, well, this is doing okay-ish, but it's not worth it. We're going to put the kibosh on it, put the old kielbasa on it. So I'd be really curious to know that. Like, obviously, they decided to end it. They very well could have kept it going if it was doing decent enough. And I feel like it obviously had to be doing decent enough for them to decide to do Dino Fury and Cosmic Fury. Like, if it was not doing well or losing money before the reboot, they would have just let it end after Dino Fury. So obviously, it had to have been doing decently enough to justify, like, hey, this is at least turning enough of a profit or whatever benefit for us to basically renew it for 2 more seasons while we figure out what the hell we're doing, but they haven't figured it out. But you know what I mean? So obviously it had to be doing decently, not to mention, you know, Netflix would have never made the deal with them if it wasn't doing decent enough. You know, you see back and forth stuff because I'll see some people being like, oh, the numbers did really well, and then other people are like, no, it's doing trash on Netflix. Obviously, it's doing well enough. If it wasn't doing well, then Netflix never would have made the deal to become the exclusive streamer for Season 2 and Cosmic Fury / this Netflix deal for the reboot. That if it ever happens or not, obviously at one point it did well enough to make the deal. If it didn't do well, they wouldn't have made the deal. That's just common sense. So my point is, obviously there is still a level of consistency to the old existing formula to justify its existence. And that makes me interested to Hasbro's point of view, because I was thinking about this when I sat down for this video. I was thinking, okay, Bandai and Saban, it was their only thing in town. That makes sense why they'd want to keep it going, even if it was only a minimal profit. But Hasbro, they got Transformers, you know, that's their brand, you know, that's a bigger deal. They have the license to Star Wars and Marvel, which is in another league of its own. Obviously, it makes sense why they would put the kibosh on it. Like, even if it was turning a small profit, maybe it just wasn't worth it to them. That makes sense. But then I thought about Disney. But then Disney is like, it's like a scale. Like, this is Saban, this is Hasbro, and then this is Disney. So, like, Disney's on that level, too, where it's like, they didn't need Power Rangers, you know, even back before they owned Star Wars and Marvel. So, they're kind of in a similar boat to Hasbro, where it would have made sense if they decided to cancel it. But obviously, they were convinced to show, like, hey, this can kind of sustain itself. And I guess for, like, what it aired on for Jetix, it did make sense to them. And, like, it was a major part of their network. But I think you know what I mean. There's different circumstances, and I think at the time Power Rangers suited them for Jetix. But it is interesting to think about that Power Rangers wasn't Disney's only game, but they kept it going. They kept the line going, but Hasbro didn't. And I'd be just curious behind the decision-making. Like, was it like... I think it comes back to what their point of view seems to be, which is basically on this weird fence, which in a way makes so much sense because I feel the franchise is on this weird fence of... It's a known brand. People know what it is still to this day, you know, even if it's only being kept alive as a contextual reference to convey what bad quality is. But it's a known brand. The general concept and everything has the potential to be something bigger because it's got a lot of the elements that other bigger franchises share. It's kind of among similar franchises like Transformers and Turtles that have found bigger audiences, and yet it has like zero respect and good reputation. So it's got this potential, but it's extremely hard to tap into it. So I think that's kind of why the main show ended. Like, I think that Hasbro want something to happen. I think they want their own thing. I think they want to tap into the potential and make their own thing, not tethered to the past, not tethered to Sentai. I think that's what they wanted. Like, not tethered to Sentai in the sense that the footage, you know what I mean? And I think they want that to happen, but they want to take as little risk as possible, which means as little investment as possible. Meaning, obviously, it's going to save them money to stop production of the existing show and only have production on their show. I think that's why it was done. But I just find that to be interesting because obviously the main show was doing well enough to justify its existence. But I do understand on a business level why it's just simply cheaper to have one production versus two. But I just find that to be kind of fascinating based on all the factors, and it brings up the question if this reboot fails, which I'm going to be honest, as a reboot supporter and wanting to get away from Sentai, I find it to be likely. And I don't mean like in a bombs day one and you've got a bunch of woke thumbnails everywhere or whatever. But I just mean in the sense that it could peter out after a couple seasons. And would they go back to that? Would they look back and say, hey, that's what makes me curious? Would they look back and say, hey, would Hasbro look back and say, hey, that's what makes me curious? It feels like right now they made the decision of like, this does okay-ish, but we don't want to spend the money to keep this production going while we want to try this reboot. So it makes sense why they did it now. But if the reboot fails, would they look back and say, is it worth it to put this back into production as it was, or is it more worth it to either shelve it or do MMPR stuff? That's what I think I'd be curious about. Like, I almost feel like they might try that. Like, if the reboot fails, might try to do like animated MMPR, something more MMPR leaning as the biggest surefire like thing, because I think they probably saw the profits for MMPR were the most. But if that doesn't work, maybe they would go back to it. Because, like, again, the show, it exists well enough to justify its existence, even if it's like a very minimal existence. But I'd just be curious, like, when it gets down to that moment for Hasbro, whether they would find it financially worth it. Like, would Power Rangers be enough of it? Even if it was that small profit that Bandai and Saban were earning, would that be enough for them to revive it? Or would they just say, like, well, we could probably bring it back and it would turn this, consistent small profit, but we got other stuff, let's shelve it. That's what I think I'd be curious to know. And the last note I want to end off on, I think is interesting. I would love to know about how the relationship affects it, because obviously Toei gets some sort of a kickback from the Sentai footage and stuff. I think even when I don't know the details, but I think even when they do their original thing, there's some sort of kickback somehow. They're connected. But in the past, Bandai was a huge factor, because Bandai America, Bandai Japan, it's all Bandai. So there was like this synergy and this added incentive to keep everything going. And I'm really curious how much that is involved, because like we had very consistent toy lines back then, and like Bandai wanted reason to keep it going, whether it was the MMPR 2010 line. I think I even remember, I don't know if this was ever confirmed or if it was a rumor, that the Mega Mode Samurai designs were actually made because Bandai was going to do a Samurai line even without a show, and that's where those came from. But the bottom line is there was this added incentive to keep everything going, because Bandai was kind of like this tether between Toei and whoever owned PR at the time. But now that that's not a thing, I wonder how much like that's involved with why PR is not kept up. But I don't know. I'll be interested to see for the future, because I just don't see it coming back as regular as it was, at least not for a long time, but I don't think it's impossible. Mainly because it feels like kind of like we were grandfathered in. Like the PR system was grandfathered in. Like sometimes with like a cell phone company or something, people can keep their existing plans, but as soon as you cancel it, you can't go back. You can't be like, well, I'm going to cancel my grandfather thing at Verizon and go to AT&T and then come back like, can I get my old deal? Like, no, I've altered the deal. Pray I don't alter it further. So I don't know. What do you guys think? And I'm just curious, do you think it could come back? Do you think how it would come back? What are your thoughts on the situation and reasons as to why it survived and justified its existence over the years? Let me know in the comments as always. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for my videos. Dawson Ryder, signing out.